Thanks for... Hello, and welcome to round 7 of Australs 2022. On the affirmative, we have UNSW 1. On the negating, we have USU 3. The motion is, has an info slide. A citizens' assembly is a body consisting of randomly selected citizens who conduct participatory deliberation on a given political issue. Citizens' assemblies are provided with specialist advice and are overseen to ensure they remain independent. In 2019 and 2020, France conducted a citizens' assembly termed the Citizens' Convention for Climate, where 150 randomly selected, demographically representative citizens were tasked with crafting climate policy, which Emanuel Macron largely committed to implement. That we support the widespread use of citizens' assemblies in determining law reform in controversial policy areas, e.g. environment, criminal justice. To begin today's debate, I would like to welcome up the first speaker of the affirmative team, Aleisha, to begin today's debate.
Amazing. Okay, I'm hoping you can all hear me. Oh, perfect. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Individuals that were selected for this panel in France, many went in self-identifying as climate skeptics. This group came out delivering France their most progressive climate policies ever. This is the best way to maximize meaningful participation in politics for issues that are life and death for millions of people worldwide. And even in like the sort of most minimal cases, the ones that impact these individuals' lives day to day within these countries, so important. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, a point of characterization. Secondly, on the principle. And lastly, why do we get such effective policy? Firstly, on characterization, and something that I just really want to emphasize here is, this is the debate where, when in some places it might yield some bad results, but in others it would often return a lot of really good results. So on side affirmative, what we're going to do is we are going to show you why this occurs the majority of the time in places that will return particularly good results. And this is kind of like all we really need to prove here as well. It is not enough for side negative to get up and say like, oh, well, what about this country or what about this state? If we can prove that it happens well the majority of the time, we win this debate. Firstly, on what it looks like. We're happy to say this looks like the French model. We think that this has firstly been modeled successfully. They came out with a bunch of climate policies that then actually got implemented, which I'll get into in a second. But it's also been modeled well in other places for the restructuring issues in British Columbia. It was also pioneered in Belgium after the 2010 parliamentary crisis as well. It's been done in a lot of places. I think the first thing it does is looks like extensive periods of education. So for instance, in France, for a series of months before these issues were dealt with, they did things like 3 weekends for 9 months to accommodate for people's work schedules. There was also taken from a democratically random census. We think that censuses in these areas are actually quite good. Often it is illegal to not fill out a census. And nations have other competing incentives to do these censuses as well, because they want demographic information on their country. This helps them do things like resource allocation. They have an incentive to have very well done censuses. The fourth thing to say is they just bring in experts. So they brought in things like climate experts and criminology experts. They were not bringing in like the heads of police, but importantly, researchers in these areas were also supervised. But very obviously and very clearly in these cases, researchers just generally have a consensus. So it is like very well known that prison is often not very good for individuals. That is something that is agreed on by criminologists. Also on climate change, like the majority of literally 99 or 98% of climate scientists believe that climate change is occurring and it's real, and that is transferred to even the most conservative countries. Even 70% of people in America believe that climate change is at least of some concern. Obviously, these researchers have a huge impact on individuals. When they're able to have that one-on-one time with that group, their belief and their knowledge is able to increase significantly. And lastly, we think that they ask effective questions. They don't just put them in a room and say climate change ? And let them kind of frazzle themselves out. We think that they're likely to give specific and targeted questions, what do we think that France can specifically do to alleviate the pressures of climate change, or to improve our situation, or meet this particular goal that nation has in a way that suits the French people, or the Australian people, or the Belgian people, or the Algerian people. Those are questions that they're able to ask. But next, I'm gonna answer the question when and where. Importantly, we have to support widespread use. This does not mean in every single situation, but we think that widespread use is really, really good. And I'm going to give some circumstances that led France to consider doing this. Firstly, Macron implemented this when there was sort of a stalemate in the House of Representatives, and citizens didn't really like this. This resulted when he tried to pass materials. This resulted in the carbon tax. This resulted in unrest and mass dissent because individuals perceived that they were being punished rather than companies themselves. But what conditions do we think this will occur in? Firstly, in political stalemates, if this is ideological, if this significant corporate capture or self-interest. And then the other thing is where there is an enormous democratic incentive. People really, really want to feel included. This is literally the reason that it was created in Belgium in 2010. The population of Wallonia, which is the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, perceived that the French-speaking part of Belgium perceived that the Dutch-speaking part was trying to exploit them and was trying to control the nation overwhelmingly because they had more financial capital there. What that was able to do is you're able to take a cross-section of the entire country to make these choices. What regimes or what countries do we think this happens in? The reason I actually don't think this happens in the worst scenarios is pretty intuitive, but I'm going to go through that. I think the first thing is they just don't have the same amount, these countries, if they are particularly oppressive, these governments just do have state control. They have no reason to want to do this because they can just pass whatever policy they want to. And so why would you go and bother surveying a bunch of people when you can just pass whatever policies you have? They didn't have ultimate control. They did not need the citizens' permission, and they were not going to do it in these cases as well. So that's why we think that this is likely to be concentrated in nations that are going to do it well, because these governments have an incentive to listen to people. They want to be perceived as listening to people as well, because that is what informs how individuals vote in the next election. But now onto the principle. This is so important. Even if these groups return a bad decision, the state exercises such a great amount of power over them that we think that their voice is still very, very important. A couple of things here. We think that people are likely to be able to break stalemates, and secondly, it just makes people feel good to be involved in policy. We think that progressive policy in some cases is not always perceived as the best, but we think that people are able to do things like consult with researchers and have conversations on these panels. The second thing to say is, irrespective of a bad outcome, they are still a sample of the population. They're still individuals that nation's education system brought up. They were subject to the laws and the advertisements in the elections that informs their opinions. They are a direct result and product of the conditions of that country, and therefore their voice and their opinions are valid. Why do we think they have the right? Being a member of a state is incredibly coercive. You are impacted by their laws. The second thing is there is a monopoly on the use of violence. Sometimes this can be physical violence against you by the police, but also you could be subject to the state's highest sanction, which is things like being put in prison for the rest of your life. Note that this is literally in the info in the topic is something that they discuss, things like criminal reform. And even in the worst case, right, even if an individual is tough on crime, maybe when they consult with an expert, you can explain to them why privatized prisons was bad. And then you still are able to do things like improve the quality of life for people, even if they are in prison. At least they're not in a privatized one that's trying to starve them and make a profit out of them. The third thing to say is you cannot opt out of living in a country. Statelessness is very, very bad, and this is not an option. The conclusion here that you should draw is that governments, the ones that will do this are the ones that are suitable and the ones that actually care about the voices of their citizens, because if you can just overrule or make whatever laws you wanted, why on earth would you do this? And we think that individuals, in light of how much power the state exercises over them, they should be able to maximize their power against it. Why are these decisions so good? I think the first thing to say is now you just get policy at all. The problem in France was there was because the election was close, there was a lot of there was a stalemate. You didn't get any policy. These things failed, the things prior failed miserably. But now you're able to filter through individuals. France went beyond just the initial tax that they had, and they implemented really, really good climate issues. They were able to levy taxes on corporations. Through citizen suggestions, they banned flights for if it is less than 4 hours on a train, you cannot fly there. They banned the construction of new airports as per the suggestions of these citizens. Citizens in these countries, when they've consulted experts, can actually be really, really progressive. And it is not just the government cherry picks a bunch of progressive individuals. There's a couple of reasons why they can't do that. But the first reason is just concern from the rest of the population, clashes from your opposition, but also the amount of media scrutiny you're under. Obviously, people's voices matter. We've proven that the best governments do this. So proud to affirm.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome up the first speaker of the negating team, Will, to begin the case for side negating.
Cool, just checking I'm audible. Affirmative team does correctly identify that this has been a method used in a number of countries. But the important thing to note about that characterization is very few countries have used it twice, right? And the reason is, the reasons that they try to give in that last sort of 8-minute block of that speech where they explain, oh, they do make better decisions because there's less media scrutiny or accountability, are actually reasons that make terrible decisions and reasons that make biased decisions that end up just making all the problems worse. I'm going to do 4 things in the speech. Firstly, some setup. Secondly, explain why you get worse policy. Thirdly, explain why you get more biased policy. And finally, how politicians are likely to abuse the system to get away with bad aims. So on setup. Firstly, first thing to note is on affirmative team, they have to support crafting the policy, not just approving the policy. That means every single nitty-gritty detail of that policy has to go through this system. Secondly, for there to be any impact to the SAP case, governments would have to accept that policy no matter how bad it was. Thirdly, what do we support on our side of the house? First thing is obviously we still have experts drafting that policy. Politicians still have a range of incentives that I'll get into as to why they would listen to those experts. But there are a range of methods that they have. That looks like select committees, which do, gauge interest from the public. That looks like having academic involvement. That looks like having industry experts. I would note to the extent that they require a whole bunch of fiat to set up the system, we can equally use that fiat to educate politicians, make sure they choose good experts, et cetera, et cetera. Secondly, I would just note that what we can support is obviously the government, passing policies that they've drafted, but often on these controversial issues, what happens is you'll do one of 2 things. You'll go to a conscience vote where every MP votes in their own, according to their own morality, as opposed to what the party lines are. And I would note that this is often instigated by a non-partisan House Speaker, like it is in New Zealand, for example. But secondly, it often goes to referendum, right? And that just means you have a fully crafted policy that experts have not let anyone who has bad ideas get involved in, and then people just get their opportunity to voice their opinions, fulfill all the principle that this affirmative team wants to do on their side of the house. You get a public voice on that finished policy. The final thing I want to deal with and set up is this affirmative push that this will only happen in good states with good incentives. But that's not their burden, right? Their burden is to support the widespread adoption. I'm going to outline in my final point a bunch of reasons why states might do this when it's not actually in their best interest for the state, but it might just be in the good interest of the politicians involved. So firstly, bad policy. The first reason it's bad policy is these people don't know how the policy works. They're not experts in the field. They're a random group of people. And you get all this rhetorical push from affirmative team to say, well, they went in being climate change deniers and they came out being, really, really good with really good policy. But they don't actually structurally explain why they have the incentive or capacity to do that. That is, when affirmative team says citizens will learn and sit down and listen to the experts and get targeted questions, those are things that plausibly could be true, but they never prove likelihood. What are the reasons that this is unlikely to happen? Why don't they know things? Firstly, I would note that the comparative, politicians have been focusing on these issues for years. It's been part of long-standing ministerial portfolios. They have incentives, political incentives to get more expertise so they don't screw up in their ministerial portfolio. Secondly, politicians have incentives to listen to the experts that they employ, right? Because better policy is good, right? Even if some people don't support it right now, in the long term, you want to be able to say, well, we were the side, the side of the house who created that better crime policy. We were the house that got, entrance into prison down. Thirdly, to the extent that politicians might be influenced by lobbyists and stuff, those lobbyists could symmetrically also influence these people as advisors. But I would note that these people are likely a lot more susceptible to that influence because people can, gaslight them a lot more easier. You'll also just have a lot less scrutiny from other parties who are probably less privy to this process than they would be the sort of parliamentary process you get in the status quo. But independent of that, the second, and I think even more important reason that they make bad policy is they simply are not accountable for the policy that they make. That is, a politician rests their whole legacy on this policy. There's no legacy for these, random citizens. They don't have any pay that is directly tied to it. They're not at risk of losing their jobs if their policy backfires and there's a big scandal about it. They don't have any elections that will vote them out if their policy is bad. That means there's both a large capacity for people to prioritize self-profit and rent seeking when they're doing this, have perverse incentives when they are negotiating with 150 other people. But it also just means they don't have the incentive to really sit down and listen really intently like this affirmative team says, because of course, they don't actually, a lot of them probably don't care as much about this issue, right? It might be controversial for some segments of the population. For those who it doesn't affect, don't really care. They just want to get out of there. I think there's lots of reasons why people want to get back to their normal life. But even if that's not the characterization, there are still accountability mechanisms that are positive influences on politicians that they don't have. Thirdly, it's illegitimate. We think there's actually a positive principle on side negative here. That is to say, the 99.9% of your population who is not in this group just didn't have any say on this policy. The difference between this group and a politician is that politician is elected by everyone to represent everyone's interests. This relies on somehow a small sample of 150 people just perfectly representing the interests of the population. The affirmative team's principle is to say that, well, they need a voice and maybe they feel good when they have a voice. But of course, they do have a voice. That's in elections, but that voice is also, in direct referendums on a lot of those issues. Fourthly, politicians have international accountability for this policy. That means you get, politicians when there is a super maybe domestically popular policy, but they would get international condemnation from rights groups and from the Western stuff. They're beholden to that because they have, trade agreements and stuff that they care about. Not necessarily the case with this random group of people. They don't see the longer term implications there as well. So policy, even if it is, is more representative, it's just going to be worse. Secondly, let's talk about why it's not more representative, why it's actually biased. The first thing to note is obviously minority groups are going to be minorities in this group of people. Compare that with politicians. Politicians, also probably largely represent majority groups. That's, non-contentious. But there are a few reasons that they are better at representing minority groups' interests. The first is they often know more just at the starting point about what affects different groups in society. That is, they can abstract themselves better from the personal experiences that they might have. Secondly, they have minorities in their electorate that are often swing voters on separate issues that they have to care about. But thirdly, politicians have to run on a platform that cares about a variety of issues. That means they might have incentives to care about minority groups' views on other issues where there might be incentives. That looks like Democrats being able to push forward unpopular, like three strikes reform policy and criminal justice because they have sort of like the blanket of abortion policy that is pretty popular for them to do so. But fourthly, politicians have incentives to appease sort of your party base and leadership, which isn't just a tyranny of the majority. Second reason it's unbiased is because of selection bias. You can't necessarily have a fully representative sample from 150 people, but additionally, it's unlikely that everyone can just agree to this, right? Lots of people have huge other time commitments because they're super poor and don't have heaps of time they can devote to this. People are going to drop out of the system. They also say you get accurate census data, but census data in most countries structurally excludes minority groups who don't even have things like addresses and phone numbers, don't get into that census data, don't get their voice heard at all. But thirdly, the loudest voices in the room, just like in juries, will take control. That means the people who have the most power aren't the ones who have that ministerial portfolio. It's the ones who are the most masculine, have their hot takes on this issue. Fourthly, individual people are more beholden to media cycles, whereas politicians sort of are used to them, could weather the storm. But the hot issue of the day, these people are probably particularly susceptible to it. And finally, it's just like citizens are more likely to be emotional, have their reasoning clouded by their own personal experience. Finally, though, even if it wasn't biased, even if it was good hypothetically, why would politicians abuse the system? First thing to note, it's likely to lead to a huge deadlock, right? Think about how often juries have to return null verdicts because they can't all agree on something. Now you have just 10 times that number of people. Obviously, it's going to be very hard for all these people from all walks of life to come and agree. They don't have the same sort of structural incentives that politicians do to actually get around that deadlock. So when they say you get past stalemates, those stalemates are likely rejected in the House if it's so much deadlock anyway. But there are also other incentives the House politicians to stop deadlock. How do politicians abuse it? Firstly, because they use it to delay action, right? Conservative governments don't have to pass climate change policy. So they'll just send it to this committee for 6 months to review, and then they'll implement a few of the policies. That's a huge time lag that's a big harm. Secondly, it just reduces accountability. You say, well, even if this policy was bad, it was just the committee, it wasn't my fault. For all of those reasons, it's just a super unjust way to get policy passed. It gets worse policy passed, it gets less representative policy.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome up the second affirmative speaker, Connor, to continue the debate for side affirming.
All right, cool. Just making sure I can be heard.
An enormous amount of that first negative speech can be dealt with in the form of 3 observations before I get into the substantive material of the speech. The first is that a whole lot of this stuff is just incredibly uncharitable high school level model bashing. They never engage in our best case or even in our medium case, where these people's identity is like not released to media and politicians, where they do have adequate supervision, like just stuff that is explained in the info slide we all had extensive time to read. So if they cannot like engage in like the Frances of the world, or like if New Zealand were to do this, or if we're like Australia were to do this and do it reasonably well, the way that people are able to be compensated fairly for things like jury duty, the way that people's work schedules are able to be like worked around, they just do not have any hope of winning this debate. The second is they try to gaslight you on a series of empirical realities in like really, really funny ways. They need you to believe that Western or developed nations, or nations that have relatively strong states and political systems that are capable of arriving at stalemates because they do not just have despotic dictatorships, are like acting super well on climate policy and listening to climate experts instead of the coal lobbies that fund them. Like, come on, guys. They are not like the criminal justice experts exist, and it took a presidential pardon to get people out of prison for simple marijuana possession, even though people have been saying that this is a bad idea back since the war on drugs even started. Like, criminalists have been saying that for decades and they have not been listened to. Like, we give you the reasons, Aleisha. I'm going to explain them again so why they do not get listened to and why the states fail people in the most controversial and important issues that affect their lives. These are state failures, and this is a correction mechanism, which is exactly why they were used in France. Thirdly, they accuse us of not meeting our burden of widespread use. No, what we identify is that we're a set of conditions that exist in France, and that's why this was done, that also exist in a set of other countries as well. That being a political stalemate on reform on incredibly important and controversial issues like climate change and emissions reduction, or like criminal justice reform, where you have like active penal, like, I know that that's a funny word, like cultures in these countries, like in the Anglo-American world. And the state has failed those people. It is not acting on them, and people are upset about it, and that is why they would adopt this. That is a widespread problem, which is why we are able to support that context, but still meet our burden of widespread application, because it would be widespread, and it's cool. They then make a weird remark about not having been done twice. Come on, give France some more time, guys. They only did this like a couple of years ago, and then COVID happened. Like, don't understand why not doing it twice. Like, if it works once and it works well, like, maybe you don't need to do it again. Firstly, then, in this speech substantively, why this will not be done poorly. And I would firstly note the comparative here is actually often no action at all, or action that is inappropriate, as it was in France with like a carbon tax that directly raised people's cost of living instead of punishing corporations, which is why this was called in the first place after enormous amounts of grumpiness about that, you know how the French are. And it is often just political stalemates, like no action at all. Why is that the case? Many of these countries have super majoritarian democratic requirements, like having 2 houses of parliament, like having a parliament and a senate, like doing all of those things such that you need to maintain a majority of both of those things in order to get something passed. And we secondly tell you that these countries often have electoral cycles that force politicians to behave in incredibly short-termist ways, either because they will lose their funding, like, you know, like a US congressperson has to run for re-election every 2 years, which means they spend the majority of their time campaigning and need money to do so, which is why they take so much corporate funding in the first place, including from fossil fuel companies. It's very, very bad. Or secondly, because they cannot afford politically, because of several decades of media propagandizing and media and political norms, can't roll back on things like tough on crime politics in the United States, because it would be electorally unpopular for them to do so, because their opposition would capitalize on it. Not because people actually think that people should be locked up for simple marijuana possession, but because of the way that political discourse works in those incredibly short election cycles, like cleaning up high visibility crime, like cracking down on that broken windows type ideology that is several decades out of date and is not what the majority of Americans believe, which is why the presidential pardon of people for simple marijuana possession was really popular. It has gotten tens of thousands of people out of jail already. It is continuing to get more out. Obviously good. People are, I think a lot of the time, smarter than their governments when they are presented with the opportunity to be so. We present them the opportunity to be so. We thirdly tell you that there's an enormous political stalemate because of enormous corporate lobbying or small bloc lobbying. Like, these guys want to say, minorities will not be represented. Good, because you know what is a minority? Like, people who are heavily invested in coal, like the people who work in coal mining industries in Australia, there are literally more baristas in this country than people who work in coal, and yet coal lobbying and coal jobs and coal interests represent, like, when the last time you heard about baristas' rights in in Australasian politics? Fucking never, because it's not a particularly politically powerful bloc. There are powerful minorities. It takes the tyranny of the majority to get them out. So be it, I guess. We tell you that bipartisanship in these countries is often politically untenable because of incredibly partisan norms that mean that you win elections by presenting the other side, and in Australia in the United States, many other Anglo-American countries as well. You present the opposition as like fatal to your democracy and like a terrible, terrible disgrace. So why would you work with them? So when you run into those supermajoritarian blocks and you cannot get cooperation, you cannot get that through, even if you wanted to in the first place. We explain that they don't want to in the first place all the time for all the reasons I've just said, but even in that case. On breaking stalemates though, because political stalemates themselves actually have a series of harms. Like even if the best benefit we can claim is like, we deferred it to a really, really good and well thought out committee. Cool. Now we can continue working on what our actual job as politicians. That's an enormous benefit because political stalemates, especially on these issues, drive people like voters and drive like media narratives to the extremes of the ideological spectrum through endless politicking and media propagandizing to get people on side. The longer that these debates take place publicly with no actual form of resolution, the worse people's opinions of them become, right? Like that's why we have enormous amounts of climate change deniers. It's because there was a political stalemate on this. People were convinced to be climate change deniers by enormous amounts of media capture and propagandizing. The second, though, is it just increases governmental non-cooperation on actually more boring or uncontroversial or unanimous things that people need, like passing a budget and spending that people kind of unilaterally agree on, or like passing any other reforms that people that are pretty uncontroversial through like backroom horse trading and like withholding votes on these because they have tension on these controversial issues, things like that. Obviously, really, really bad for these countries. But they then tell us that there are like basically two areas this could go wrong. One, the policy returns could be very bad, and secondly, like that they would be good but not adopted or something like that. Why is the first not true? They are presented with expertise, the most qualified people who are not like really politically affiliated a lot of the time, and also importantly know what they're going into, know that they are pitching to the average reasonable voter, unlike this team, and know that they're like effectively being presented with 150 randoms and need to explain to these people why this is a problem and so that they can understand the scope of what solutions need to be. But secondly, this team is incredibly like cynical. Like most people, when they're good, like if they're kept anonymous and not aggressively lobbied to, which is like fine because we afford those same protections to juries, and they're like able to attend those things because we make accommodations for their work. People are actually pretty good, and they feel a higher sense of self-imposed burden because they finally feel important and they finally feel listened to, and they often act on their self-interest, but like that equates out to the self-interest of the average person. Like people in France return policies to raise taxes on corporations, not on themselves. Because that was obviously a good thing that those people did. The second is like, well, nobody would pass like really good policies, or that these policies would be like weirdly short-termist or something. Look, to the extent that these policies are bad, we then tell you that like they just have the right to make those bad choices in the event of a failed state, which is the second and last part of this speech on the principle, which is just like these guys seem to think that things like gerrymandering don't exist, like things like drawing electoral borders or imposing those supermajoritarian requirements don't exist. People are not getting their say in the status quo, not electorally, not through debate, and this is an excellent way to break that deadlock, and it is a principally just way to do it, because you are literally taking a random sampling of society and letting them, the people who are hurt by the state the most, who are under the most of the state's control, make those decisions. That is an unambiguous principal benefit. Easy enough.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome up the second negating speaker, Charlie, to continue the case for side negating.
Just let me set up my paper and stuff. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to begin this speech with some rather embarrassing but nevertheless true admissions about my time at university. Firstly, I have never watched an economics lecture. Secondly, I had available to me 6 months of expert advice on economics. And thirdly, at the end of those 6 months, I failed my Intro to Economics final. I don't trust the average person to craft policy because I don't trust myself to craft this policy. We offload this task to politicians for a reason. It's their job to choose what the people want and to implement what the people want well. It's a complicated job. It's a job that requires training, and it's one we ought not assign to a totally random group of 150 people, even if they are demographically representative, and even if they do have experts available to them. Two things in this speech. Firstly, on the rather ridiculous principle, and secondly, on whether this policy is actually good. Firstly, on the principle then, I think this is just silly. People already vote in elections. Those very effectively fulfill the mandate to have a democratic body choose which elections get chosen. They tell you that these elections are sometimes corrupt. Firstly, they're just better because you get more people involved. Obviously, wherever there's random chance that it's unrepresentative. Secondly, people have to consider multiple issues in elections, so it's harder to rile people up and have the media sway them on one particular issue, since they have to address a variety of issues. And thirdly, elections allow elected representatives to keep policy updated rather than them being stuck with whatever a specific group of people chose at a specific point in time. That's why elections work, and to the extent that there are issues like gerrymandering, at the point where they're propping up a massive change to the way policy is decided, we can probably prop up some anti-corruption measures as well on our side. Second and more important issue in this debate then, is this policy actually good? And that's the most important issue because it clearly just has the biggest impact on people's lives in the most meaningful way. First claim they make is that policy is well crafted because they have expert advice. First issue with this is no amount of expert advice, just on a comparative level, is going to match what politicians get. You might have expert advice for a couple months, but a career politician who's in power for a number of years obviously has access to more expert advice in that they are one person with a team of advisors rather than a team of advisors addressing 150 separate people, but also to the extent that they have access to that advice in a more intimate way for a longer period of time with less other things intervening. Second issue with this, though, is that people have just less incentive to listen to those experts than politicians do. Firstly, that's because narratives about distrust in experts is fairly common amongst the average person. They don't trust what experts are saying, even if it seems reasonable, because they perceive that those experts have been appointed by the politicians that were for the party that they didn't vote for. Therefore, they're not going to trust their advice. Secondly, they have less incentive because they don't have experience in what happens if you don't listen to experts. They haven't gone through an election cycle where they ignored experts and experienced the consequences. And thirdly, it's because in between those experts, they still consume media that undoes all the work that those experts might feed into them. Because as Ali said in her speech, maybe they get experts on the weekends, but throughout the weekdays, they're still watching Fox News' breakfast show every morning. And that does a lot to undo any set of progressive expert advice that they're receiving on those weekends, where they're probably not even paying attention to the boring experts trying to drill in policies that they don't support from the get-go. But third issue with this is that they just don't have experience in implementing that expert advice, even if it was good. Policy is complicated. Policy interplays with varieties of other policies, and it is extremely difficult to translate that expert advice into meaningfully good results. Why is that so important then? And I think it's far more damaging than this team gives it credit for. Because it's not just important that we get policy on the table, that policy actually has to be good. Firstly, because that's what's required to achieve the positive impacts of policy in the first place, but also because there's a fucking huge harm they don't ever interact with to bad policy. Because if policy doesn't work, you undo decades of progress to get that policy in the first place. If you implement massive progressive reform, and then that progressive reform doesn't work because it was done by a group of random people, people are now distrustful of progressives. They're less likely to do more progressive reform in the future. They're more likely to repeal that policy, and you undo all of that progress that you've previously done. Even if it takes more time when politicians do it, that time is worth it, because not taking that time and making sure that policy is good comes at the massive trade-off of undoing all the progressive progress that's occurred in the past couple of decades. Second claim they make then on the effectiveness of these policies is that policy is now more progressive because these people have access to expert advice, while the average voter does not. First issue with this is, whilst to the extent that the average voter might only consume media, and that's how they choose their politician, once that politician is elected and is actually in charge of implementing the platform they ran on when they were voted in, they do get access to expert advice. And for the reasons I previously explained, that expert advice is better. And politicians often act as a positive moderator on voters. Note, for example, the example we give you in American politics about the Democratic Party using its popular policy platforms like healthcare to ensure that good policy platforms that might not be supported by majority rule do in fact get implemented. Politicians are able to take the wildly chaotic, variable, inconsistent, and often just totally stupid policy beliefs of the average person, moderate them using expert advice, and turn them into workable policy that achieves good results for people. Because unlike these individuals, if this policy turns out badly, their career is on the line, whereas these people obviously have far less incentive to care about the results of this policy. Second issue with this, though, is that it's unclear that this is actually what's going to happen. That the experts are going to be more progressive and influence them in a progressive way. Firstly, because it's just untrue that experts are always unanimous on every single issue. Maybe that's true on the specific issue of climate change, but there are a variety of other issues that are likely to be talked about through these mechanisms. Like, for example, criminal justice reform, where there are experts on each side, both conservative and progressive. But secondly, even where there is largely a unanimous consensus, you have obvious incentives to make sure both sides are equally heard out, because you want the results of this caucus to be legitimate, which means that you have to ensure that on the face of it, both sides are being heard out. So maybe 98% of experts agree that this specific issue should be resolved in a progressive way, but you have to send in some experts from that 2% of people who agree with the conservative side. Otherwise, this seems totally illegitimate, and you face massive criticism from opposition parties, which means that now is obviously far, far more biased, because previously you had maybe 98% of experts agree, but both sides seem fairly even because you have experts from both sides in the room. And people are obviously likely to presuppose their position before going in and only listen to the expert that already agrees with their views. Therefore, people just choose the media narratives, which they give you and concede is probably likely to sway them in a particularly negative way. And thirdly, in terms of what will happen, they tell us that they can just veto these issues if they are wildly bad policies, which likely means that you probably just get the same level of progressiveness than you did before, because if you have a large number of conservatives in power and the result of this caucus is progressive policy, they're just going to veto it every single time. Otherwise, that is obviously in their political incentives. Third issue then, in terms of making these progressive policies, people having progressive influence because of the experts, is it's just unclear that they will listen. And fourthly, even if you maybe get rid of lobbyists now and you just have expert advice, lobbyists obviously turn their gaze to the media and barrage these individuals every single day of the week when they go home and listen to that news. So the lobbyists still impact these people in addition to those experts. Third claim they make then is, now you at least get some policy at all, you resolve deadlocks. Firstly, it's unclear that deadlocks are actually that bad. What deadlocks do is stop the tyranny of the majority from enforcing policy on minority groups, because you have minority groups who maybe don't have a majority on this issue, but they still have enough power to ensure that the majority that is opposing them can't enforce policy on them that they don't like. There's a variety of instances in which that deadlock might be good. For example, in circumstances where maybe that policy reform isn't actually needed, the status quo is good, and we shouldn't undo the progress by reforming it backwards. Second reason, though, why deadlocks aren't that bad, because they just do get resolved. Politicians have incentives to resolve them, and they have capacity because they can make concessions on different issues to ensure that deadlocks resolve. And thirdly, though, it's just unclear that this wouldn't just exacerbate deadlocks, to the extent that if the result of this caucus is inconclusive and or unexpected results are occurred, it would probably just expand this deadlock, and that would be a bad thing. For these reasons, very, very proud to negate.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome up the third affirmative speaker, Bennett, to conclude the case for side affirming.
Bennett is perhaps even more unstrategically in the bathroom, as he has been for about the last 50 seconds or so. I assume he will be back extremely shortly. Apologies.
That's fine. Sometimes you just have to go to the bathroom in the debate.
I feel like this is as far as 3 bathroom breaks that have been taken over the course of this debate, this is by far the least strategic. So
okay. The question of this debate is obviously whether this process creates good policy, but that outcome involves a lot of moving parts. And so I want to explore that through 3 questions. The first is, will there be more good instances of policy or bad instances of policy? Secondly, even if you believe there will be more bad instances, are the good instances more important? And thirdly, even if you believe there are bad instances, is that even worse than the comparative that they have to defend, which is, of course, the status quo? Firstly, will there be more good instances or bad instances? We give you a number of reasons why this process will filter out bad decisions, but so do they. So let's go through theirs first, and then I'll re-explain our reasons. They firstly provide a huge number of very cheap challenges that Connor correctly calls out, which is poor people won't participate and you won't care about the kind of thing that you're debating. Obviously, we'll pay people sufficiently such that they have to participate in this. Also, this has to be demographically representative, so you have to get a certain number of poor people in that, but also obviously they'll care about these issues. Like people walked out of this in France saying it was the best experience of their life. Like you're deciding policy for your government, you have friends and family telling you to care. Obviously you will actually just have to care. This is an extremely cheap challenge. And they keep going with these, right? They're like, well, the loudest voices in the group of 150 will win, and they'll reach deadlock in this group of 150. But what we say is we're going to facilitate free discussion. Like these people are not toddlers, but if we do need to get moderators in to be like, you need to shut up now and let another person talk, that is exactly what will happen. And also you will not reach a deadlock because you have to find a majority. You have to come to some form of verdict. The verdict could be not doing anything, but it is not like repealing it back, or it is not like, it is probably going to be like 76 versus 74 will vote. We have to do something. We have to make these set of changes. It's not as if it's not all or nothing binary proposal. You just implement what you think the majority agrees would be a good thing. Let's deal with the better challenges they actually have to this. They have 3 of them. The first is that the people on this panel will be self-interested, but that is obviously how democracy works, right? There are a number of people who all have their own perspectives and interests, and they vote in accordance with them. So in that group of 150, if it's represented in that way, what a good thing. But we in fact believe this process will be good for that and flip that harm for 2 reasons. Firstly, because you now have to consider other people's perspectives. You have to talk to them. You actually have to interact and humanize the minorities or lower class individuals that you never actually interact with every single day in the real world when you actually vote in an election, because now you are trapped with them. You have to talk to them. You have to realize their perspectives. They will be explained to you. Most people have empathy. Most people will consider how they can actually help those individuals. But secondly, you can also just have experts frame this in the long term. Like experts will be, well, if we do not take climate change action, in 20 years' time, or for your future generations, there will be an enormous set of harms. Even privileged people are likely to consider that as a serious effect to them. So it's just about how you frame the discussion. People will either perceive it to be in their self-interest to take action, or realize it is in other people's self-interest, and because people are not always just awful, will actually care about that. The second challenge they provide is about minorities. Firstly, as we explain, minorities in this process will in fact be better humanized than they would have been in other elections because their perspectives will be heard, as I explained previously. Secondly, you also have to represent people like women and people from lower classes, which would also be good because like women are 50% of the population, the lower class is the majority of the population. These would be all good things. They would not be a minority in that discussion. They would be at worst half and at best like a majority of that discussion. But thirdly, I will just deal with the narrative about why politicians are better on minorities in my 3rd issue. That was poorly explained by them. The final thing they say is there is media manipulation of the people who go in here, and therefore they will not be able to vote correctly. Firstly, like 70% of people believe that climate change action should be changed in the United States. The United States has lagged categorically behind its climate change commitments because of corporate corruption. It's unclear how that gets worse, and I'll explain it later. But secondly, in response to the second negative speaker, this is the all-time best way to defeat an echo chamber, and I'm going to call it now a pressure chamber, because this is what this is. You are stuck in a room with 150 people, and you have to stay there for a number of days. You have to hear each of their perspectives. You have to be confronted with statistics and hard facts. This is the best possible way to get people out of their echo chambers. If like you had to design a policy that would get people to change their previous perspectives, this is the policy that you would design. And they say, they say you can't, the final challenge here is that they say, well, you can't craft policy, because you're just a dumb person who is a member of the public. Like politicians are not particularly that smart. In fact, as they can say, politicians rely on experts to advise them when they craft policy. So these people rely on experts to help them to craft policy. It is symmetric. That means all of our reasons and why debate is good, expert information is good, democratic representation is good, like non-cynical representations of how people engage in good faith in democracy all apply, and there will be more good decisions made than bad decisions. But on the second issue, even if you believe there are more bad decisions than good decisions, we believe the good decisions will be more important, because the previous issue obviously segregates a trade-off, but they underestimate just how good this can be. Like the US, which has the largest prison population in the world, can ask the question, how do we address this? Australia can say, we need to remove coal from our industry. How can we remove it? New Zealand can say, we need to address our obligations to Pacific Islanders. How is it that we can best do that as climate change threatens their homelands? This is better than the bad decisions that they can point to for 2 reasons. Firstly, because the worst case is not repealing existing legislation. It is just like implementing minor reforms on the issue that is tackled at hand. Whereas because the issues are not going to be like, how can we better punish minorities? That was never going to be the issue. The issue was like, can we actually fix this pressing issue in the first place? But secondly, like we just fix climate change. Like in a lot of countries, there are mining companies that bribe politicians so that, they pay for their election campaigns so that when they are in government, and seeking re-election, they have to not put forward climate change bills because that will harm their corporate donors. We do not do that because we can just propose the legislation of we should solve climate change, and climate change is solved. We solve it. They have no response. That is obviously pretty important. But thirdly, even if there are bad instances, why is the things that we are talking about still better than the comparative? I'm going to explain this issue in two parts. Firstly, I'm going to explain that all the problems about this process that they identify also apply even more to the comparative, because they say, well, voters are bad. They're misinformed by media cycles, and they don't care about minorities. But these are the people that elect politicians, like the people who go into this 150 group are the ones that also vote at ballot boxes. So if you believe that they are bad, that problem is at best for them symmetric because they are the ones who vote for those politicians. But we also explain it is necessarily worse because you have added problems of those politicians being corrupt, being captured by corporations. They say, oh yeah, and then the reason for this is just like the intuitive and empirical fact that lobbying does happen for politicians. They say, oh, well, it's the same for the people in this group of 150, they can still be lobbied. No, we can necessarily ensure that they are independent. We can shut the gates on the lobbyists lurking out at the back door, oh, don't we care about BP oil? We just don't let them into the group. That is how lobbying stops. And they give such lazy responses to why it is that politicians will be good. They care about the issues. They are expert. They care about their legacy. They have international accountability. They care more about money than all of those things. And the simple reason for that is because without corporate donations, they do not win elections. That is the structural reason. They can care about their legacy after they're elected, international accountability after they're elected, all those things after they're elected, but without sponsorship, political advertising, funding, corporate support at the head of their party, they never get elected. And that is why they care about money more. They are always captured by corporate donations and corruption. And that is why they trample over minorities, because minorities are not the ones bankrolling their campaign. So all these problems point out why, even if you believe this process is bad, their process is still worse. And even if the comparative is a stalemate, we say a decision is better than no decision. I will briefly address that. Oh, and they say, well, actually, stalemates are often protecting minorities at second negative. Stalemates never protect minorities. Stalemates, why would the tyranny of the majority manifest in a stalemate? It would manifest in a decision of that majority. And on their principle, it is clearly not a complete principle because you elect only the one candidate that represents your area. You don't represent everyone. So it's the same-ish thing. Thank you very much for listening to my speech.
Thank you for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome up the third negating speaker, Sam, to conclude the substantive portion of the debate for side negating and the debate as a whole.
Narendra Modi's government in India in 2019 tried to pass a controversial citizenship law that would have stripped millions of Muslims of their right to remain in India and access basic essential human services. And the reason it was stopped was because the politicians and ministers in that government were accountable to political backlash. They were accountable to international economic consequences and reputational damage to India and economic damage to India. But if that decision was instead up to 150 random average Joe Hindu nationalists that were representative of the wishes of the majority Hindu population, you would have a humanitarian disaster. The reason we have politicians is to act as a safeguard against the basest impulses of a tyranny of the majority. It is the reason that we are able to protect any degree of minority rights, the reason that tough on crime policies that are held by the vast majority of people are not the law of the land in every conceivable fashion. And that is why this affirmative team just cannot win this debate, even as much as they want to rely on their incredibly favorable characterization that this is just about climate change. It is clearly not. There is an entire other aspect of this debate they just refuse to engage. Let's start with I'm going to start firstly by talking about the principle, because we just win the debate on the principle alone, even independent of all the practical considerations. Because they just tell us, well, these people need a voice. But we tell you they have a voice. It's called an election, noting their setup about this largely happening within democracies. And we tell you that even when elections maybe have gerrymandering or maybe have some level of corruption, they are still preferable because it's still the whole of the population rather than a random subsection, which could, by pure statistical chance and how statistics work, be unrepresentative, come up with a policy that is not genuinely what the majority of people want. There are margins of error involved with this. And we tell you that these people have absolutely no accountability whatsoever for setting national policy that has the potential to influence the entire world's climate or the entire world's controversial legal issues. We tell you that they have no legitimate mandate for power because nobody ever elected them. They never had the consent of the population they were now creating policy for, and there was no capacity to remove them or to undo a policy via direct election, via a different party running on a different political platform. So even if in the most charitable case for this affirmative team, you believe that policy gets better, it is so illegitimate and evil that they cannot win this debate, because you cannot forcefully take away people's democratic rights to actually influence policy from everyone and concentrate it into 150 people who then never face any accountability whatsoever. Independent of the policy question, we already win the debate on that alone. But secondly, let's talk about policy and the characterization of what this would look like. The first thing I want to address is their claim that, well, this would be useful for breaking stalemates. And that's a really good thing, because when you break a stalemate, you get better policy. And again, I want to know how favorable and, like really uncharitable this characterization is from them, because it fails to deal with, firstly, the situations we tell you about where a stalemate is preferable to bad action. For instance, if there's a deadlock in the US Congress where House Republicans want to cut Social Security or build a border wall in exchange for negotiations with, Joe Biden, and then you throw that over to a representative sample of the American population, which is about 65% white and quite reactionary on those stances, that is a bad thing. We tell you there are an enormous number of circumstances where the majority, will of the majority is a bad thing. It would impose enormous harms on people, and we ought to stop that. But secondly, we explain that there are reasons that these assemblies are also likely to deadlock or have significant delays. So we tell you that it's often an active harm to break those deadlocks, but even to the extent that it's not, and sometimes it does create decent policy, that benefit is heavily mitigated by the enormous delay that goes into this in the first place. What do we tell you about these assemblies? We tell you firstly that they are structurally and systematically not actually representative in a vast majority of circumstances. That is because, firstly, it is a simple numbers game. If 13% of the US population is black, then only 13% are going to get in there. And that is comparatively less influence than they have over politicians, because they make up electorates of a vast array of politicians who are far more numerous. And that we explain right from first, those politicians do have incentives to care about those populations to at least some extent. We tell you, secondly, that there is systematic undercounting of minorities in terms of things like the census. For instance, illegal immigrants from like Latin America in America are notoriously undercounted. You would not actually get a fully representative sample here. Thirdly, we tell you that there's likely to be massive amounts of sort of personal sway and influence from people who, fit into the expectations of what people believe to be, an authoritative leader within the deliberations within what is effectively a massive jury room, just like it happens in juries. Fourthly, we tell you that these people are likely to be swayed and clouded by emotional judgment and personal experience. For instance, I know someone who is a victim of a crime, therefore we should be tough on crime. Whereas politicians have to consider a much wider range of consequences affecting a far wider range of people, which is why they have to take into account more evidence, why they have to take into account better decisions. And Bennett's assertion that it's like a big pressure chamber, that is a bad thing, because the loudest voices win. People's emotions get the better of them when there is an enormous amount of stress, when they have to absorb huge amounts of information when they're untrained to be able to do so. Clearly, that is bad. It means you get things like more tough on crime politics. If you ask Americans what they want to do about mass incarceration, overwhelmingly the answer is double down. They see it as an individual moral failing, not a systematic problem that they need to do things like decarceration about. Clearly, that is not something that is favorable for this affirmative team. We tell you that you get more privileged representation and power within these groups, which means you're more likely to get policies that favor people who are wealthy, who are landowners, who don't want to have to pay the cost of mitigating climate change because they're going to be old and dead or unaffected by the time it actually happens. Bennett tells us at third, and we get a bit at second as well, that voter self-interest is fine. But self-interest, we tell you, is far worse when it's unmoderated on basically a single issue, rather than elections where you have to consider a wide range of different issues. Because somebody could be very personally and opposed to things, in favor of bad policies like being tough on crime that hurts a lot of people, but they could also like, for example, a left-wing party with a less tough on crime stance because they're better on things like wages or workers' rights. And we tell you that moderates their capacity to make damaging decisions. You take that away when you make it effectively a single issue referendum. And the climate issue they rely so heavily on here, I just want to know, how exactly are you going to convince all the wealthy people to care when they are only voting on their own self-interest within that room, as opposed to an election where they might vote for a more left-wing party who's offering a better pension, for example, who's offering better, economic welfare for them into the future. We are able to temper the worst of people only on side negative because the politicians who make the policy have a far wider range of incentives. Secondly, in terms of what this policy looks like, the affirmative team offers two arguments. Firstly, they tell us that politicians have bad political incentives, because there's media scare campaigns about crime, or the opposition might attack them. But I just want you to be comparative here. If media campaigns have been scaremongering about crime for decades, how on earth do you think the average Joe off the street thinks about crime? They are the people who inculcate that media directly. They're the ones who do the voting that makes politicians scared. Obviously, it's better to have a middleman who can moderate those influences rather than giving criminal justice policy to the people who support it in the first, who support mass incarceration. The big push, secondly, is about lobbying and corruption. Firstly, we tell you that anti-corruption measures exist. We're happy to use what fiat we have in this debate to try and improve that, but also happy to support existing measures. Secondly, we tell you that politicians don't just care about money, because money is a means to an end. You use money to be re-elected so you can hold on to power, but that requires you to win elections. So you still have to do things like care about your image. You still have to deliver actual wins for your electorate. You still have to do things that are broadly popular. So clearly, to the extent that money influences you, it isn't the sole influence. And all of the other material we tell you about why politicians have good incentives is at least as strong of a countervailing incentive there. But thirdly, to the extent that you believe that these politicians are corrupt, that just also nukes the affirmative team's case in the way that they would set up these commissions, right? Because if you believe that these politicians are just in the pocket of the mining lobby, then politicians who then set up these commissions would probably just make the experts this affirmative team relies on also in the pocket of the mining lobby. Why would they set it up in a way that hurts the people that are paying them? I want to note importantly, in terms of framing for this debate, we don't have to prove that politicians are overwhelmingly good in order to win. We just have to prove they are better than these commissions, these citizens' assemblies, and we have overwhelmingly done that at this point in this debate, because we tell you they have more expertise. Policy is complicated. You need lots of experts who can advise people who know what they're doing, because even in the best case where these people do have good intentions, if the policy is mediocre, it is going to impose a significant set of harms, because you can't get that fixed, because people lose faith in that commission, because it's really easy for it to get undone. All of the benefits of this affirmative team are just wildly speculative, and that is even ignoring the concrete harms we give you in terms of accountability, in terms of the actual capacity of people to have a say over what is happening to them in their lives. That is the reason this negative team very clearly wins this debate.
Thank you very much for that speech. As is traditional, we will now cut the speaking order in half and cut the speaking time in half and flip the speaking order. I welcome up the negative reply speaker, Will.
This affirmative team's win strategy is essentially to try and vibe control the debate, to make you believe that we lose because our responses were lazy and cookie cutter high school examples. But we were the only team that actually engaged in likelihood analysis, rather than simply cherry picking examples like climate change or cherry picking the characterizations where this would actually happen. And we were the team that engaged with both options that could happen, and explain why both of them would both be illegitimate, unrepresentative, but also just create worse policy for the long term. First question I'm going to deal with in this reply is questions of both the principal claims from both teams and the ideas about fairness. The claim from affirmative is essentially that elections suck for a set of reasons like gerrymandering, and that people deserve a say. But of course, that was defeated by our team. Firstly, because we explained that elections tend to be relatively representative. But secondly, even if they're not, the affirmative team model excludes 99.9% of the population from this process. Thirdly, we outline a set of reasons why these assemblies just tend to be biased. And the response from this affirmative team, particularly a third, is to say, well, this is a cheap challenge. But it's not a cheap challenge. We say it's structurally likely. Notably, this is a supports debate. It's not like they would be able to implement it in particular ways they wanted. They have to support the Adventist thing. It's about likelihood, what's most likely to happen. But finally, even if you didn't believe any of that analysis, we just proved to you down the bench that accountability is a much more important principle to democracy than representation is. That is, accountability for the actions that your representatives make, in this instance, this 150 random people, is a precondition for that legitimacy of government policy. It's much fairer, it's much more legitimate. As Sam says, we win on that. But let's talk about overarchingly when it is likely to be used. This affirmative team says it's likely used to resolve deadlocks that are uncontroversial. But importantly, often politicians don't have an incentive to break those deadlocks, and in those instances would be unlikely to set it up in the first place. But secondly, we explain that deadlocks are actually sometimes very useful because they prevent the tyranny of majority. Maybe that's not a good outcome in climate change, but in issues like criminal justice, that's obviously something that's super, super important. Then is the push at first and second that they say will only happen in good states, obviously dropped at third because it's not actually as important. Compare that with our pushes about where it will happen, because maybe sometimes politicians would do it for good reasons, but more often we say they will do it so that they can delay the process and exacerbate it further, and that they can do it to avoid their own accountability for the sorts of issues that they would be pushing. That is also principally illegitimate. But Finally, most important question in this debate, how good is the policy compared with the status quo? The first reason that this policy is worse is bias. And I'd just like check your notes for the previous point, but saw throughout our case, I don't think the responses come close to the material we give. Secondly was on knowledge. They try to say knowledge is symmetric because you have experts on both sides, but Charlie outlines reasons why politicians both have a more in-depth relationship with those experts, but also have more incentives to actually pick up on that knowledge than these random people do. So clearly that is just, and insofar as knowledge is super important to making policy good, that is something that is uncontentiously a negative one. But finally, and most importantly in this debate, is accountability, because their strongest material in this debate is to say that politicians are corrupt because of lobbying. But we give a set of responses to this that mean it's not that important. The first is to say that to the extent that corruption exists, it influences their side of the house too. That is, you can influence the media that all these people watch in the weekdays, but also you can choose which experts to appoint that seem to be nonpartisan. Secondly, we explain that if they have some fiat to set it up in a good way, we have some counter fiat, we can do that as well. But thirdly, we just say politicians have other incentives rather than just the money. Compare that with the affirmative team at their very best. They never outline a way that these citizens would have accountability beyond just saying if they have they'll feel they have a sense of duty to do the right thing. Rather, we explain why they have no capacity to be removed from this office, why their anonymity is literally protected by affirmative side of the house, why there's no reason that they would actually care about the outcomes here. And I would know Bennett's weighing at the end of this is, well, the bad ones are worse than the good ones are good. But of course, you do implicitly repeal existing policy when you do this. And also we give reasons why actually a deadlock isn't that bad. When a policy result is bad, we obviously win. But even when it's good, we still win because their policy ends up being poorly thought out and fails, undermining the progress of progressive movements in the long term.
Thank you for that speech. And now to conclude today's debate, I welcome up the affirmative reply. Connor.
All right, making sure I can be heard. I'll start this reply by making an observation about Lord of the Flies, which is what this team seems to think will occur during these citizens' conventions of white, of privileged, of rich people mudslinging at each other and slinging their own shit, trying to kill each other and immediately descending into chaos and struggling because they struggle for their own survival with no supervision and no guidance. I would note, though, that that is effectively what Parliament is. It is what politics is. That exact group of people with that exact amount of interest in self-survival and re-election and self-sufficiency, and that is why we get back bad policy. That is why we get shit flinging. That is why we get deadlocks. That is why we get political stalemates that threaten the existence of entire countries and their ability to pass their budget, the ability to not descend into extremism on either sides of the spectrum. That is obviously a very bad outcome, and it is not what happens in the citizens' conventions for reasons that we give you from Aleisha, because frankly, they get their legitimacy, like any ability to do whatever they want, by being represented through their degree of representation, demographically, through all those kind of things, the degree of consideration that they make when they make these decisions. That's why Francis took 9 months, again, as we tell you at Aleisha and down the bench, and from the amount of oversight and neutrality that these bodies have. Like, you get legitimacy for those decisions because you bring in neutral experts, because you have enormous oversight as to how that process occurs. Like, it is literally not my fault that this team has not, like the average reasonable voter, been reading the front pages of international newspapers over the last few months. This was huge, and they produced like 150 climate reforms that were the most radical that France has ever done. It is just not our fault that this team wants to wheel out stock arguments and lazy responses in response to empirical reality. Let's firstly talk about where this debate takes place, and then I'll ask the question of how policy gets crafted. They call our characterization of where this debate takes place extremely favorable. Correct, because I would also call it empirically and structurally proven. How do we do that? Firstly, by pointing to the examples where it is used, which note is not in India and is not on supermajoritarian issues, like just empirically. But secondly, we explain why it is not in those instances. We point to the structural reasons why these things are used in the first place, because they are controversial, because you could not do anything because of the kind of political deadlocks and political debates that tend to take place, and really importantly, because you needed people to feel like they were being directly listened to. Again, material we give you at Aleisha, myself, and at Bennett to no response. Like, you needed people to get off of the street in France because you made their life harder. You needed people to believe that they were being listened to. So you listened to them. You listened to them really, really directly. And importantly, and devastatingly for this team, you did not just listen listen to them, like their thoughts of like right off the top of their head, like the way this case seems to be constructed right then and there. You did it in an incredibly considered way. You did it in a way that meant that you would not face opposition, as we tell you at Aleisha and at myself and at Bennett, from your own political opposition, from international media sources, for being undemocratic. So secondly, in this reply, ask how this policy gets crafted. And I would note just how much of this team's case around how the policy gets crafted and why it would be tyranny of the majority, why it will somehow punish minorities more than these states already that punish them, relies only works when and if it was actually substantiated before third negative, or secondly, if these things operated, which we prove they do not, like going to 150 US citizens and asking people welfare, yes or no, vote tomorrow, also blindfolded, hear no evil and see no evil, which is not how these things work. Like France took 9 months. It was pretty costly. It was a really life-changing process for everybody who participated in it. And it allowed that country to actually move forward and break really, really intense that backslide into fascism and a really intense political deadlock that happened after their last election, especially with respect to climate policy. How does it actually operate? It does operate with enormous accountability, and it can only operate with enormous accountability for all the reasons we tell you. It does operate over a long period of time, which, as we tell you down the bench, and then again at Bennett, gives people the time to not be awful, right? Like people behave in awful ways off of the top of their head as a knee-jerk response based on their own biases. Most people are pretty good. That's why education works and matters more than Charlie, I guess, gives it credit for. Lastly, they produce a set of recommendations for a targeted problem. 150 of them is some of the best policy that France has ever had on climate change. We want that in widespread instances. We want that for everyone. Proud to affirm.
Thank you to both teams for what Jenny and I thought was a great debate, a very engaging debate, and congratulations for making it this far in the tournament, etc. I'm sure you'll all do great for the rest of the tournament. What I'm going to do in this adjudication is, firstly, I'm going to tell you who won, and then I'm going to step through the points of clash, explain why we saw the debate fall the way it did. Jenny and I were unanimous in giving this debate to the negating team, USU 3. So congratulations to USU, commiserations, unfortunately, to UNSW. 2 points of clash in this debate. Firstly, on the principle, and secondly, on the outcomes of the policy that occurs. Firstly, on the principle, affirmative says and sets up that this principle is important to make sure that people are represented in a democracy, and that's for a few reasons. Firstly, because the state can be coercive. Secondly, because there's a monopoly on violence. And thirdly, because you're unable to opt out to this of the state. I think negating is able to co-opt this quite well by explaining that elections are a way in which you are able to represent yourself in the state as well and meet all the burdens that affirmative sets up of needing to be represented in the state, e.g. you vote for someone so that the state, the state that has a monopoly on violence over you has your representation in it as well by casting that vote. The burden, therefore, becomes on affirmative to show that their policy is either more representative to fulfill an extra additional principal outcome, or to say that elections are bad. I think they try to do both of those. I think Jenny and I believe that negating has the ability to prove that elections are going to be able to get better, but we don't think that affirmative shows that elections are significantly bad in the status quo, that people don't actually have representation. We think negating is able to explain why people cast votes and why they're able to get select committees, for example, to poll people to make sure that representation is heard, not just in voting, but by making policy as well, which means that elections are likely to be representative. But secondly, in terms of this being more representative, negating points at reasons such as statistical, I've forgotten the word they gave, but significance, which means that this is a random poll of the population and there are chances that this could not be as representative. At the end of that principle, then, we think affirmative does enough to prove that this is not principally bad and it is like principally fine to undertake these the things where people the things that we were talking about in the debate. Pretty embarrassing that I forgot the word for them, but the things where people come together and talk about the policy. but it was not principally better than elections and probably was slightly less representative. We think they take a narrow loss on the principle then. Secondly, then on policy, which both teams appeared to agree that this is far more important than the principal clash. And that's because the outcomes are far more significant and change drastically compared to whether this policy is implemented or not, rather than the small marginal change that occurs on the principal level. Two clashes under policy. Firstly, on how well this policy is made, and secondly, about the amount of accountability that the public has over these policies. Firstly, on how well they are made. Affirmative has a couple of pushes to say that it's going to be, these are going to be made far better policies than they will be under the government. The first is that the government is bad because they focus really heavily on the amount of money they can have, and that's because campaigns are really expensive. So they're very susceptible to lobbying, they're very susceptible to taking money to make sure that they can get to the next election cycle. I think this is well defeated by negating when they explain why money is a means to an end, and down the line they explain a number of other incentives that operate on politicians, for example, their legacy, for example, pleasing constituents, that mean that money is not the primary alternative. And I don't think Affirmative explains why getting into that next election cycle matters so much more than your legacy. Comparatively, we get weighing at third negating to explain why money is just a means to an end and why all those other factors mean that you cannot compromise them to be able to take money. I think that means at the end of that clash that the government isn't going to make significantly bad policy because of lobbying power. They're just going to, it's going to have a small effect, but it's not going to be uniquely bad there, and that I think negating is able to mitigate the harms that Affirmative says that governments have on them. There is a push by Affirmative to say, look, at the status quo, lobbying power is really bad, and point to some specific examples. And I think those examples are persuasive, but aren't representative or aren't structurally explained as to why they are the majority of cases where lobbying affects it. And I think that structural weighing that occurs at third negative is able to beat those examples then. The second push Affirmative has on why this policy will be well made is from the committee itself, and it's to explain why people are likely to listen to these experts, why they're going to participate in good discussion and be able to come to a consensus at the end of that. There's a couple mechanisms here. The first is to explain that they get experts in and they conduct them on times where people are always able to participate, e.g. the weekend. They pay them so that they're able to do it, and they feel important, so they want to actually participate in this process. And secondly, because of empathy, because of, when you sit down to people and hear their opinions, they're much more likely to change their mind. They're much more likely to negotiate. And they're much more likely to be able to come to a consensus on what Affirmative claims will be a progressive policy. There are a few pushes from negating as to why they believe this will be unlikely. The first is to explain that people are likely to be set in their ways. They are likely to believe experts which validate their own viewpoints. And I don't think that gets sufficient response from Affirmative, other than saying that experts have a large agreement on what type of things we should put into policy. I think we get clear explanation at second negating as to why experts might not have a consensus, and therefore why people are likely to self-validate their own ideas that they already had going into this, rather than just negotiating or rather than just relying on empathy, because people are self-interested. That self-interest is accepted by Affirmative, which means that I think people are likely to pick something that is more aligned to their side. The next push negating has here is to say that people are likely to buy into media cycles. So they're not likely to be as long-termist, as well thought out as politicians who have legacy incentives, because these people don't have any incentive other than just themselves. I think Affirmative says the self-interest is really good. It results in examples like not having to pay tax as a consumer, but instead taxing the corporations who actually pollute. I think that's a very persuasive example, but doesn't explain why structurally in the majority of cases, why that self-interest could be really beneficial. It just mitigates the point by explaining that some instances could be good. But I think negating is able to explain that that self-interest probably manifests in very harmful ways, like benefiting majorities over minorities compared to politicians who have a lot more incentive, because these people are likely to be swing voters to capture their vote. or because they are able to hide good policies under the rug. For example, Democrats hiding climate change bills under the broad support they have for overturning the abortion ban in Roe v. Wade. The last push here made by negating as to why this policy will be bad is about experts. And they say these people don't have the ability to craft policy. They're just random Joe Blogs off the street, and they're not going to be able to craft policy that is very good for a long term. I think that's successfully washed by affirmative when they explain if politicians have access to experts and these committees have access to experts, that means both people have the ability to get experts to write those policies to make sure that they're able to work in the way that people intend them to work. And I don't think that push from negating is successful to explain why that policy is likely to just be done in a terrible way that doesn't work and underdoes lots of stuff. Which means at the end of that, I think that policy is likely to be worse than the policy that gets passed by governments, because people are far more self-interested, care far more about the media cycle, and are likely to be swayed in ways which are not representative of the large population of people, but rather of the statistically small sample size that they have. They're unlikely to cooperate together. They're likely to have their views self-validated, and therefore it becomes much more likely that this policy is badly made, and it would have been better to run it through just a normal political cycle. The last push there on that is saying, oh, but a political cycle is bad because of stalemates, and that's clearly likely the most likely scenario where this happens. I think it becomes unclear at the end of the debate whether stalemates are good or bad. Affirmative points out some instances where stalemates are bad, like in France with the carbon tax. Negating points out some instances where stalemates are good, like in the United States. No one weighs those instances against each other. Some stalemates are good, some stalemates are bad. I'm unclear which percentage is which. And in that case, I think it is better to resolve it in a political system based on the principle I already think is more representative, and I already think that the policy made in these committees is likely going to be bad. The last thing here is on accountability, which is that negating pushes that these committees are far less accountable because they're swayed by bias from the media far more, because these people are anonymous, and so that there's no way for voters to politically check them, which means that this decision is taken out of voters' hands, and it's really, really unaccountable, and politicians have to implement that. I think we get good responses from affirmative to explain why the system itself is accountable, and that's why people are anonymous, so individual people can't be lobbied. That's why the system has to be representative of a range of views and a range of people, which I think makes me believe at the end of it that the system itself is accountable, but the individual people in it are not. Their decisions are not checked in the same way a politician's is checked, and therefore the outcomes are far more likely to be swayed self-interested, swayed towards the majority and the loudest voices in the room. Even if a moderator is present, those people still have sway, I believe, at the end of the debate, and therefore the system is less accountable. That's an extra harm that sways the debate towards negating.